So welcome, I am Tim Wood. I'm the Chief Partnerships Officer from Co-Develop. And as part of a multi-stakeholder group, we've been a part of an ongoing discussion around climate change and DPI and the role of DPI in addressing that climate change. And we hope to address some of those issues now. I'm going to ask each of the three panelists that we have to introduce themselves, Sarah, Pramod, and Naveen. As we get started on this, we're going to try to do sort of a lightning, quick discussion of points that we've talked about and the various things that our organizations are working on, and we'll try to weave those together quickly, recognizing that everyone wants to get onto the buses to go to dinner at 6:30. So, Sarah, could you share a little bit about what Dial has thought about on the climate front?
Great. Thank you, Tim, and thank you all for sticking around and being here for the last session. So very quickly on climate, just to frame it, one of the pillars of DPI is data exchange. It's also the pillar which is the most has the most outsized impact on climate change. And so when we started looking at it on the Digital Impact Alliance's front, we formed a climate data joint learning network. And in this joint learning network, we were joined by climate experts, those working on climate issues directly, as well as folks working in DPI, folks working in data specifically. And we're looking at, what are these models or innovative approaches that can help unlock climate use cases and help unlock gains in positive climate action. And I will say that, just very quickly, three of the key insights that we've uncovered. The very first one is that there are some buckets of challenges that we need to look at when we talk about data exchange and climate. The first bucket of challenge is the data itself. So is the data available? If it's available, is it accessible? The second bucket of challenges is trust. So if the data is available and accessible, is the data credible? Does it have features of good data? So is it updated? Is it timely? Does it have the metadata that's required that's attached with it? And then the third bucket of challenges is financial data. So if it's, if the data is there, it's available, accessible, it's trustworthy, does it have financial sustainability and investment behind it to keep it updated? And then the final bucket of challenges is on capacity. So capacity challenges are important because even if you have all the features of good data and it's all incentivized financially and everything, but if it's not usable by the frontline governments or the frontline communities that are being asked to use it, it's not an effective way. It's not been shared effectively. So I would then move on to the second point, which is that it's actually subnational governments. When we talk about capacity, subnational governments are at the front line of climate action. So when we talk about DPI, we're really talking about national governments. But at the end of the day, it's these subnational governments, like if you consider like a flood situation or a forest fire or any of the other extreme weather events that we're facing, they're the ones that are making decisions on resource mobilization, on disaster response, on early warning systems, et cetera. So how do we make the data systems usable for them? And I think when we talk about looking at models and creating models of data exchange, we need to consider that the intelligence or the processing of the data, the analysis of the data, needs to be built into the system as part of the offering, as part of the solution. Because they don't have the resources, they don't have the capacity to really do that analyzing and processing. And oftentimes when it comes to climate events, whether it's resource management or disaster response, that data needs to be available to them right at their fingertips. So that's point number two. The first point was on the gaps that we have, the challenges that we're facing. The second one is on the importance of addressing the frontline actors that are Hello? Okay, perfect. So we've looked at some innovative approaches for data exchange which work for climate use cases. These include things like data trusts, data spaces, peer-to-peer decentralized networks. But I think more than the tech, the tech is the easy part to solve. More than that, we really need to think about the enabling factors. And one of the enabling factors, I'm going to go back to this point of capacity and the point of subnational governments being at the front lines and often not having the resources. The intermediaries, and by intermediaries I'm talking about national governments, I'm talking about, there could be civil society organizations, system integrators. The intermediary component or stakeholder becomes really, really important. And they need to be working there alongside these government, frontline governments, subnational governments that are facing the brunt of climate change to help them interpret the data. So I'll leave it at that. That was quick lightning round, and pass it over to.
Perfect. Over to you, Pramod, for our continued lightning round.
Yeah, lightning round. Yeah, so it's perfect. Thanks for hanging around, by the way. So we have 15 more minutes before the bus shows up. So Sarah, you set it up really well. I think accessible, trustworthy, incentive aligned, and eventually the first mile, or we don't call it last mile, maybe they are the first mile, where the people are or the action is happening. The first mile having much more composite solutioning within their hands. Just throwing data at them is not useful. So our learning has been, much of our effort or applying DPI thinking is towards the same thing, is that first of all, I think data is, especially with climate, data is very, very, very federated by design. National level, subnational level, private players, some of the international players, weather data or ocean data, depending on the geography you are living in. So the data is really, really, really federated. Okay, what does it mean? It means we should never imagine any centralized mechanism to collect and assimilate this data, because it won't work. Because it really goes to the origin of data. So where does the data originate? Is that trustworthy at the origination? Is it curated well? And is it made accessible? So that's point number one. So keep it federated or decentralized. Keeping it decentralized is very, very key in your mind. Second thing is that we should definitely, and that's the DPI learning, we should definitely unbundle the supply of data to the demand side use cases. Because if you ask the data provider or data producer to think about the whole stack and how it's all going to be used, you're doomed. I mean, we are going to have a mega RFP process. Okay, it's never going to come out of anything, right? So we need to really keep it simple for them. Let them produce the data, make it accessible, make it trustworthy, catalog it, make it available. Available in a decentralized manner, but allow layers of other innovators, maybe government, quasi-government, or NGOs and academic organization to build layers of value-add, intelligence, and eventually solutioning and tools towards the first mile. Because if you ask for the data producers to provide the tools for the first mile, they won't even know where to start from. So that's the second learning, is that you have to unbundle the pipeline or the chain and make sure the data producers are not bothered about doing it. Just make it accessible, trustworthy. That's it. Produce it. And the third one we learned is that one of the discussions that we come up is that the data needs to be, sometimes we go on one extreme saying data has to be free, open. On the other side, we say, no, data has to be fully, sort of private and, let the, data be financialized in one sense, right? I think the truth lies somewhere in the between. So I think that's one learning, third learning we had, is that we cannot be opinionated about the data licensing or the data pricing. Okay, this is very, very key. Because if we make an opinionated view for the rest of the world, it's not going to work. So the idea we were thinking is that then what is the infrastructure through which data sets, curated, trustworthy data sets that I was talking about, can be discovered, contracted, accessed, and used. And sometimes the contracting may be very specialized licensing for academic purposes only, or licensing can be only for something and so on. Let it be. Let that be an open ecosystem that allows open licensing, differentiated licensing, and pricing models. So that's the third thing, because that allows incentive alignment better than the three things. So these three, I would say, keep it decentralized, unbundle the chain so that people can do one thing and collectively we gain. And the third, create an infrastructure that is more allowing diversity of licensing, diversity of data sets, diversity of choices, and so on. And that's where we think protocol-driven approach can be actually applied for achieving this. Because if you leave it decentralized, it looks like fragmentation if you don't bring it together through a protocol. So we need some sort of protocols to bring it together as well. Yeah. Naveen,
Thank you,
after
Pramod, especially for emphasizing the protocol. Naveen, please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. I'm stepping in for Kezom. Apologies on her behalf. She had to go for an unplanned engagement, which was beyond her control. But I think Sarah and Pramod has set the stage really well. Probably I could get into an example that we are focusing on from a UNDP perspective. One of our focuses is to, like Sarah and Pramod mentioned, is to ensure transparency. And one area is carbon markets that we are looking at. How do we ensure transparency in carbon markets, green finances, and those areas? To give an example, in voluntary carbon markets, there are different agencies who are sort of verifying, ensuring these credits are verifiable and transferable, but there are no one single standard between these organizations, and we are not saying there should be one single standard between organizations, but it shows the need for standards. It shows the need for importance of data and data being interoperable between different systems, because there are various verifiers in the world right now, and there are different contexts, different challenges with verifications when it comes to voluntary carbon markets. And also, it's not just the standards that are required to how do you calculate carbon emissions. So there are standards around that. How do you price carbon emission? There are standards around it. But there is no one aligned standard, or there is no interoperability between these standards. And that's one area that we probably need to focus on, where DPI could play a pivotal role. And the second area is just the aspect of monitoring and verifying. To take a simple example, if someone is saying they have developed a project where we have planted 100 trees, and they've got credits, and they now can sell it to a private sector actor, but say after 5 years, those trees are not there, but the credits have already been transferred and been registered. So how do you ensure there's this constant monitoring and verification? This is where geospatial data and all other kinds of data mechanisms come into play. And that's one other area, again, DPI plays a critical role, because it's not just one area where a group of verifiers go and verify it, but there's a continuous geospatial data that happens, and different actors can access the data and verify it constantly. So that's the second area. And this applies to various other climate areas, but I wanted to give a simple example. And the third is, how do we leverage this data for other sectors? So what role does climate data play in terms of healthcare sector? So that's one area of exploration for UN systems and multilateral organizations, to ensure there is multi-stakeholder collaboration. And this is not just within the climate system or the urban development system, but going beyond that, how do we ensure there's this appropriate data exchange happening between healthcare system and climate adaptation system, so that vulnerabilities can be addressed, or other possibilities and opportunities can be identified and anticipated much earlier. So these are some of the three areas that I want to leave out with, and sort of stress on the importance of multi-stakeholder collaboration when it comes to climate, which is a very difficult space to be in.
Thank you, Naveen. One of the things we often talk about in the DPI space is the importance of use cases to help anchor this abstract thing that is digital public infrastructure that can be difficult to understand from a technical perspective, and to try to ground that into what does this actually look like for people who are using it. We've talked about the importance of trusted data, of protocols, of the confidence that we have in data, but what might this look like to an individual in a country? Do either of you have experience, or any of you have experience, seeing DPI principles being applied in a specific use cases in countries that you can help outline, just to give it a little bit more color for how do these abstract concepts come into play when we actually look at it in a real world environment?
Sure, I could take it. So as we've been exploring some of these models, one of the models that we've looked at is something called the data trust model. And there's an example of an organization that's working as a data trust. And by a trust, I mean an actual fiduciary organization which has the right to hold the data and has the liability that comes with it. And then members need to adhere to the rules and the governance, established rules that they have established as a governance committee. And that organization is called the Place Fund. And the trust is called the Place Trust. And what they have done is they're holding geospatial data, but not just any geospatial data. It's high resolution, high quality geospatial data, which can give you details on, what side of the house should a solar panel sit on, right? And so when you think about how that ties into something like renewable energy, particularly at the household level, how they can how households can be attached to and get electricity even without being attached to the grid. So I think this is a type of influence that I think that these use cases can have at the household level, at the individual level, and can really provide access to things like energy, connectivity, even finding aid in times of a crisis. So if there is data on who the vulnerable communities are, this type of data can really figure out what vulnerabilities they have, how, like the details of the house that they live in, how vulnerable it is to floodplains, and what kind of interventions the government can provide to them, and what kind of security blankets they can access as well.
I'll add a couple of points. I think from an individual perspective, so when we look at it, they really don't care. They care about their family welfare, economic opportunity, access to better financial products, or better work opportunities and so on. So I think we have to eventually land it there. If you want a societal level shift, then you have to land it at the incentive for individuals and families to be able to act right. So we see that in the green transition now in India, where people are very rapidly urban. Much of the urban India is a very service economy. There's a lot of home delivery. Everything happens at home, including the haircuts and everything else. And they all move to electricity, electric bikes and electric delivery vehicles, because it's just cheaper. It directly affects their earning. So all the cars are starting to move to electric in the urban area. So eventually we have to, it's not a theoretical construct. Anything, whether it's a general purpose DPI discussion or whether it's a climate related discussion, it has to land when it lands at a person or land at a family on the ground, it has to be directly economic incentive and work and other opportunities in their life. Nothing else matters. It's not that people want to live in a bad place or a dirty place and so on, or a flood hit, potentially high, risk place. That's all they have. They're stuck there. So, but her point on the systemic side is very valid, that systems can better prepare, like better insurance for those people who are vulnerable. Prepare them using the data. But for the individuals, it's all about directly the day-to-day opportunities, everyday opportunity for them. Yeah.
Naveen, anything to add?
Yeah. Just on a different topic, not on individuals, but in communities, with respect to communities, one of the early signs that we are seeing with the energy sector is the unified energy interfaces, which Pramod could talk more about it, is where we could see where communities can manage and share data on the energy usage, which sort of helps with the local level smart grids and those kind of areas, but it's at an early stage. A lot of startups are working in this space. So that's another one that I wanted to just highlight.
And how do we make this actionable? We have tons of people at the conference today who are from countries who are here to learn about DPI and the best practices. What can they take back to their countries and implement that would benefit the overall climate data infrastructure and the approach that they take? What would be the one, maybe two pieces of advice that you would give to someone who wants to return home and start making progress on this data and DPI for climate agenda?
I can start with it. Yeah. So I think maybe one or two very, very clear things is that if you are working on a system, very high chance you are working either on the supply side, that means where the data systems that end up producing data, or on the demand side where the systems that end up using that data. Ask if you are a data, if you are working in a system that is producing data, find out a intervention that can bring the data out. Curate it, make it accessible. So make it trustworthy, make it accessible. Put a price, it's okay to price it or license it, but bring it out. If you can do one thing, is to not ask everybody to come around and let's all agree. You know, if you put 5 people in the room, we'll get 5 decisions, okay? So you can't put anybody in one big room and expect anything good to come out. So I think as an individual, if you're working in a project, get the data out. But if you're on the demand side, you ask the question, what are the two things, like, carbon credits. I mean, if you're working on that area, look for one intervention that can actually use climate data to do a better, let's say, insurance product or a better planning or better, a support system, for example. So whether G2P or anything else you want to do. So I think everyone is involved in some project or other. And very high chance there is an implications to the climate because it's everywhere, right? Every system has an implication. So you can ask that question. Bring the data out from your system. Don't ask others to do. You do it. That's my ask. Yeah.
Sarah or Naveen?
I'd just like to second what Pramod said. And just to add to that is, there are a lot of digital public goods available, especially some of the points that we spoke about is verification, authentication, say in carbon credits or various other climate-related aspects. These public goods are available. It's just a matter of someone taking it up and prototyping these things. So that's one probably a suggestion that I would leave with, so that when we go back to our own countries, our own initiatives, can we take up all these existing public goods and just prototype in the context of climate problems?
Yeah, I would say that this is a relatively new area. You know, climate and the intersection of climate and DPI is still underexplored, and there's a lot of scope for new innovation here. And I'll give you a small example of a startup that we worked with in Indonesia, and they realized that there's a lot of data lying on social media, right? So Indonesia is very special in terms of climate because they actually have the entire gambit of climate threats. They have volcanoes, they have flooding, they have extreme weather events. They have like 7 or 8 at least that they deal with at one time. So they converted Twitter feed to be able to read and determine where the most need was for resources to be allocated. And that entire map that they've created, just with the alarms that are going off on social media, on Twitter, they're able to create a map which the government now asks for whenever there's a climate emergency, so that they can plan their resources and verify that the data that the government has the same information and that their resources are being allocated. So I would say, really, it's about right now. The time for innovation is now, and as individuals. as startups, as governments. I think there is a lot of creative ways that we can start thinking of how to solve the climate issue as a DPI community.
Excellent. I'm going to take a gamble. We have about 4 minutes left. Are there any questions from the audience? I'll come down and play talk show host if anyone wants.
Yeah, there's only a few
You
of
have-
them.
you have
so
until I
you
get
can
to the
always
steps to raise your hand.
target them.
Someone? Anyone? Yes, come on down. You're the next
you said-
contestant
what was
on
the last-
DPI questions. The question was, is there anything else we can do with climate and DPI other than data exchanges?
No, there are definitely a few things. By the way, data is such a powerful asset, whether it's in open data, whether it's in individuals' data. It's a fundamental economic asset, as close to money. Okay, data is really that important. So I don't think we should ignore the fact that data credentialization of data or bring it out is very important. But there are other areas. For example, tomorrow I would mention a little bit. Tomorrow, let me plug in. Tomorrow I'm talking at 9:30. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Finternet and where asset tokenization effort, global effort, there's nothing to do with India. It's a very global effort that allows every real-world asset to be tokenized. And so quite like data coming out, if you can tokenize your property or agriculture produce or whether it's a battery bank in the energy sector he's talking about, the moment you tokenize it and make it verifiable, applications can start. Suddenly now an insurance company can say, finally, I don't have to do the whole thing myself. I can actually now offer a better, faster, cheaper insurance because someone else has actually credentialed and tokenized that asset, right? So there are many few layers of things you can peel, but I mean, climate is really large, so I'm very sure there are more areas where we can start with as well. Yeah.
I'll add that in the DPI space, payments are one of the most common components,
Yeah.
and payment infrastructure are one of the
It's
most common
huge.
components of
Yeah,
DPI.
yeah.
And there are numerous examples today in countries where people are affected by climate-related disaster, and the governments are providing social protection and social assistance through digital payments to those individuals. And so that's one of the areas where DPI and climate are evident today, and we're seeing that in
Yeah,
quite
that's
a
I
number
think
of
is a very
countries.
important point about payment. G2P itself, we say G2P for regular benefits, but G2P's power is going to really take off when it comes to climate disaster support or resilience support, for
As it
example.
didn't
It's
coded
huge.
yet. Sarah, it looked like you had one last thing to add.
Actually going to mention the same one that you did, anticipatory cash transfers. This is like, when you can predict that there is a climate event that's going to happen, and to really safeguard the people that are affected by that, you can provide them with a social protection in the form of cash. And that's the one use case that I've seen as well.
Yeah,
So.
great. Maybe you need final thoughts? Or good. Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I promise to wrap
Thank
up
you.
on time.
Enjoy
so
the
we can
dinner,
eat.
by the way.
good
Yeah. All right. Take care.